Hi everyone. So today we're going to go through skeletal muscle contractions. So just as a heads up, I know I've put OCR and AQA in the title of this video. OCR ask about this in more detail than AQA do. So AQA only really require you to know what a motor unit is, the structure of one, whereas OCR are more likely to examine how does an electrical impulse travel down this neuron, and then how does that then stimulate muscle fibers to contract. So if you're an OCR student, then you're going to get some value out of understanding the process of skeletal muscle contraction. But if you're an AQA student, you're still going to get value here because they do want you to know what the structure of a motor unit is. And then they also want you to be able to recite the all or none law. And we're definitely going to talk about the all or none law here. So this topic is looking at how the brain sends an electrical impulse via neurons all the way to your muscle fibers to get them to contract. And the first thing both exam boards might examine you on is what is a motor unit. So you've got the terms motor unit, but then you've also got the term motor neuron. So they're slightly different things. So a motor neuron is just this part of the diagram all the way up until the muscle fibers. So that is one motor neuron. And I think it's important to remember that neuron is just a fancy term for nerve. So this is just a nerve that is carrying an electrical impulse from your brain to your muscles. You can almost remember this like M for muscles. It's a nerve that is sending an electrical impulse to the muscles. So that's what a motor neuron is. And then a motor unit is that one motor neuron and then all of the fibers that one neuron stimulates. So every motor neuron will be responsible for stimulating a group of fibers. That might be tens of fibers or hundreds of fibers. And just so you can sort of visualize this a bit better, let's say this is the cross section of the tricep muscle. You might have a motor neuron that is stimulating, let's say, this cluster of fibers here, but then you might have a completely different motor neuron that is then stimulating these fibers. So per muscle, let's say this whole thing is the muscle, per muscle you will have loads of individual motor units. So that's what a motor unit is if you get asked about that in the exam. It's just one motor neuron. So just the one motor neuron and then all of the fibers that one neuron stimulates. So this neuron here is responsible for stimulating this group of muscle fibers. And I don't think really this is that important, but I don't think you'd ever get a question with a diagram saying label structure A, for example, but you never know. So what you've got here, the main things that I think is important to know about is the axon of the neuron. So the axon is this long part of the neuron that the electrical impulse travels down. And then another important structure, you can't see it on this diagram, but at the end of the neuron, between the neuron and the muscle fibers, there is a gap. So if I just draw it out here for now, let's say that is the neuron. And then that is the muscle fiber. This gap is important, and that gap is known as a synapse or a synaptic cleft or a neuromuscular junction. I personally call it a synaptic cleft. So I've been a bit lazy here. I should have put synaptic cleft there. So I'll just type that out here. But yeah, they all mean the same thing. A synapse, synaptic cleft, it's all the same thing. It's just that nowadays, as the exams are going on, the mark schemes are getting stricter and stricter, so it's probably best to write synaptic cleft. So they're the structures that are present in a motor unit. You've got this one motor neuron, and then you've got all the muscle fibers that one motor neuron stimulates. Now, another important thing for both exam boards is what is meant by the all or none law. And the all or none law is in the context of just one motor unit. So it's not in the context of the whole muscle. This law is not saying that the whole muscle contracts or it doesn't. It's not saying that. It's just saying, if I stay on this diagram here, it's just talking about one motor unit. So it's saying that all of the muscle fibers in this one motor unit, all of them will either contract or none of them will. So in this diagram here, you'd never get a scenario, let's say, where these 4 fibers are contracting, but the rest of them aren't. All of these fibers in this blue circle would either all contract or none of them will. And that's what the all or none law is saying. And in a recent OCR mark scheme, I've actually seen credit for this number. I was really surprised, but they have given credit for that. I think it was 2 years ago. So what this law is saying is that if the threshold is met, and that's where this number comes into play. So basically, let's say that this is the inside of a neuron. Normally, when the neuron's not firing, it's really negative. The charge is really negative inside the neuron. And that's what this -70 means. You don't need to really understand this for A-level PE. But basically, inside the neuron, normally, there's this really negative charge of -70 millivolts. And what the all or none law is saying is that a certain threshold has to be met in order for this neuron to fire. And that threshold happens to be this number, -55 millivolts. And therefore, to get from -70 to -55, the inside of the neuron has to become slightly more positive. So it has to get a bit more positive to reach this -55 value. And if it reaches that value, then the neuron fires, an action potential occurs. And an action potential basically is an electrical impulse. But I thought this diagram illustrates it quite well, that the inside of the neuron got a bit more positive, but it didn't quite reach that threshold, and therefore the action potential didn't fire. However, this time round, it did reach that -55 value, and therefore the action potential occurred. So that's what they're on about here. The all or none law states that if the threshold is met, if that -55 millivolts value is met, then all of the muscle fibers in that one motor unit will contract. So let's say there's just 3 muscle fibers here. All 3 of those fibers will contract because the threshold was met in the neuron. Whereas if the threshold isn't met, then none of those muscle fibers in that one motor unit will contract. So none of those 3 fibers will contract. So that's what the all or none law is saying. It's saying if the threshold is met, all of the muscle fibers in that one motor unit will contract. But if the threshold isn't met, none of those muscle fibers in that one motor unit will contract. And I can definitely see in the future where they might be really strict and have in one motor unit in bold. They don't at the moment, but they could do. So basically, in layman's terms, what this is saying is that pretty much just the electrical impulse has to be strong enough in order to stimulate those fibers to contract, but they would definitely want the term threshold within that. Sorry, it's just glitching out there. There we go. So that's what they're saying, or that's what you'd want to say if you get a question on the all or none law. Now, moving on to what's going on all the way from the brain to the muscle fibers. This is where it is more relevant for OCR than AQA. So they want you to be able to describe the order of events that are occurring down this neuron all the way until the muscle fibers contract. So as I just mentioned earlier, normally inside the neuron, there's this really negative charge. And this negative charge inside the neuron needs to become more positive in order for the neuron to fire. And your first marks here are going to be for saying that an action potential travels down the axon of a motor neuron. Now, in the past, that's got you 2 marks, and in the most recent mark scheme, it was only 1. But you'll definitely want to say that an action potential travels down the axon of a motor neuron. You then get a mark for explaining what is that action potential. And what happens is when the brain stimulates this neuron, it causes sodium ions that are outside the neuron to flow into the neuron. And these sodium ions are positively charged, as you can see here. So when they flow into the neuron, they change the charge from negative to positive. And that's what we were on about up here, going from a more negative to a more positive value. So that process there of going from negative to positive is known as depolarization. And you get a mark for saying that sodium ions cause depolarization. So we'll just write that there. I've written all this out in the slide that comes next for you to properly read through. But that's what's happening so far, that an action potential travels down the axon of a motor neuron, and that is created by sodium ions diffusing into the axon, causing depolarization. And remember, depolarization just means going from a negative charge to a more positive charge. Now, the action potential then reaches the end of the axon. And at the end of the axon, there is this chemical called a neurotransmitter. And the specific one for muscle contraction is called acetylcholine. Now, in the mark schemes that exist so far, you can just say neurotransmitter. You don't have to say acetylcholine. But again, the way things are going, I imagine they might put this in bold in future. So it is worth knowing because it is in the mark schemes currently. And this is a chemical that is then secreted into the synaptic cleft, so the gap between the neuron and the muscle fibers. And they want you to say that that acetylcholine or that neurotransmitter diffuses across the synaptic cleft until it reaches the muscle fibers. And when it reaches the muscle fibers, it will then bind to the muscle fibers. And pretty much, if enough of it is bound to the muscle fibers, it will cause depolarization in these muscle fibers as well. So these muscle fibers will go from negative to positive, and that is what causes muscle contraction. So overall there, you would say an action potential, if I just tick these points in red, an action potential travels down the axon of a neuron. That is created by sodium ions diffusing into the axon, causing depolarization. Neurotransmitter is then secreted into the synaptic cleft. The neurotransmitter diffuses across the synaptic cleft until it reaches the muscle fibers. And then if the threshold is met, this is where you can add in the all or none law. If the threshold is met, all of these muscle fibers in this one motor unit will contract. So that would be the maximum marks available. Obviously, if it was a 3-4 marker, you wouldn't need all of that to get full marks, but that they are all of the marks available there. I won't go through this. This is literally just repetition of what I've outlined up here. This is the visual aid for this slide here, but this is so you can revisit it in your notes. But that is the main long mark question that you're probably going to get as an OCR student. Now, the final thing, I guess this could be asked about in both exam boards, and I guess it'd be more of an AO3 point for AQA, but I have seen this as a short mark question in OCR. It was a question along the lines of what would be the impact of recruiting more motor units? So what they're asking you there is, instead of, let's say, the brain just recruiting this red motor unit, what would be the impact of the brain recruiting the red, the green, and the blue motor unit all at the same time? So what's happening there is that the muscle, a larger proportion of the muscle fibers in that muscle are all contracting at the same time, and that would just increase the amount of force production. So when your brain detects that it needs to produce a lot of force, it just recruits a larger proportion of the fibers in the muscle. So if I'm, let's say, lifting this pen, my brain doesn't need to recruit a large proportion of fibers at all. But if I was to lift this speaker, it's heavier. So my brain needs to recruit a larger proportion of fibers in the muscle. So if they do ask a question like that about what is the impact of recruiting more motor units, it's just that there will be greater force production. So you're going to be able to lift more. And then finally, not that I don't think this is really that important at all. I can't see how they'd ask a long mark question on it. But the brain always has an order that it recruits fibers in. So let's just pretend that this is a type 1 motor unit. This is a type 2A motor unit. And then the blue one is a type 2X or a type 2B motor unit. They're basically the same thing. Technically, that is more correct in humans. But you get the mark for either of those. So the brain will always recruit all of the type 1 motor units first. If it decides that your muscle still isn't producing enough force, it will then tap into the type 2A motor units. And then if the thing that you're lifting is so heavy and the brain thinks, I still need more force, then it will recruit your type 2X motor units. So there is this order of recruitment, but as I say, I don't think it's that important that you know that for the exam. But that's just in case they ask about an order of recruitment. It could just be a one marker saying, what is the order of recruitment? And it does go in the order that you'd imagine it. Type 1, type 2A, and then finally type 2X or type 2B. So that is the skeletal muscle contraction topic all done. I've just uploaded a question from OCR and then a question from AQA so you can see the mark schemes for them. So this is asking you to explain how a motor unit is stimulated to cause muscular contraction. So just what we've gone through, and it was 3 marks. Now, if we have a look at the mark scheme there, here you can see you get 2 marks for saying that an action potential travels down the axon. That's point 1 and point 2. That is created by sodium ions causing depolarization for point 3. Then the neurotransmitter is secreted into the synaptic cleft for point 4. The neurotransmitter then crosses the synaptic cleft until it gets to the muscle fibers for point 5. And then if the action potential has reached the threshold, all of the fibers in that one motor unit will contract. So 0.6 and 7 are for the all or none law. So that's maximum marks there for an OCR mark scheme. And then, as I mentioned at the start, AQA don't really ask about how the brain recruits muscle fibers so much. It's more, they're just AO1 marks, knowing what a motor unit is and knowing what the all or none law is. So this was I think it was a 15 marker, yeah. And it was linking Newton's laws, but also the recruitment of muscle fibers. And in this topic for AQA, there's stuff like spatial summation, tetanic contractions. But for AO1, you do, as well as knowing all those types of summation, for AO1, you would get marks for just saying, what is a motor unit? What is the all or none law? And then you leave it at that. There's no AO2 application, AO3 for just knowing what a motor unit is. So if we have a look at the mark scheme there for that question, there's just a few AO1 points here. So just stating what a motor unit is. So a motor unit is a motor neuron and all of the fibers that it stimulates. And then the all or none law, this isn't amazing wording, but if a motor unit receives sufficient stimulation, so what we've said the threshold value there. So if a motor unit reaches a certain threshold, then the action potential will be released. So the electrical impulse will travel down the neuron and all of the fibers in that motor unit will contract. So the main things to get across there is just if the threshold is met, the action potential fires and all of those motor units will contract. So that is everything done, guys, on skeletal muscle contraction. I hope you found it useful, and please do leave in the comments any other topics that you find useful for me to run through and then apply to a few questions. I also do offer one-to-one tutoring, and the link is in the description for that.